Hello, y'all, and welcome to your paragraph writing assignment for Trifles. Before we discuss the symbolism of this play, which is what I'll have you do some writing about, I want to kind of help you understand some of the deeper meanings of Trifles, really understand the central theme of this play by talking through irony first. In my in-person class, we're actually starting class with this today, so you're kind of at a disadvantage there, but I do want to lead you through how irony works. That'll help us understand the theme of this play a little bit better. So it does say all three types of irony exist in Trifles. Incomplete sentences give one example of each type below. Starting with dramatic irony right here. As a reminder, dramatic irony is when the reader knows what characters do not. I went in order easiest to find to most difficult to find in this document. I hope that you know that for dramatic irony, the thing that we know as the audience in Trifles that the characters don't know is that Minnie Wright is in fact guilty. Minnie Wright did in fact murder her husband. Now, I should note here that the play never outright tells us that Minnie is guilty of murdering her husband, but I think it's pretty clear to us that she did through the evidence right there. The characters who do not know this are the three men in the play. So neither the county attorney nor the sheriff nor Mr. Hale has any evidence, has any clue that Minnie Wright murdered her husband. We know that she did. The two women, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, have a very deep suspicion that she did as well. It's an example of dramatic irony. We know something that at least some of the characters do not know, and that helps to build up the theme of this play, as we'll discuss in a moment. The second type is situational irony. Now, this is the most common form of irony. It's a little bit tougher to spot in Trifles, but this is where the outcome is completely different from what's expected in the play. For this one, we want to think through kind of how the play splits into thirds. In the first third of the play, it's mostly the men speaking. In the middle third is almost entirely the two women kind of uncovering all the evidence. And then in the end, they kind of come together towards a close there. One thing to note here, once again, the play starts off heavily with the men. We might expect from early on in the play that the men are going to uncover the whodunit of this mystery right here. But notice that the men, who are trained investigators, the attorney, the sheriff, and then there's Mr. Hale, who's a witness as well. Notice that none of them find any evidence in this play. Who finds all the evidence, even though that women in this play are looked down upon for being unintelligent, or are looked down upon for only caring over trifles, unimportant things? The women find all the evidence, right? So we might say, for our situational irony here, we might say the women, rather than the men, find all of the evidence. So even though the women are looked down upon this play as being less than the men, or less intelligent than the men, or being worried over trifles, unimportant things, notice that the women are the ones who figure out everything in this play. The men, in the end of the play, have no idea. They find nothing. That's gonna build up to our theme in a little bit here as well. There's actually three cleverly hidden pieces of verbal irony in this play. We'll go kind of a 1, 2, 3 with this. There we go. The first piece is the title of the play itself, Trifles. We know from our vocabulary terms that trifles are small, unimportant things. The title of the play is related to that, but it's ironic because it is the small details that prove Mrs. Wright is guilty. So even though the men don't care about those small details, and the women do identify those small details, it is those small details that show that Mrs. Wright is guilty. So even the title of the play shows a little bit of irony here, highlights that irony that the men find nothing and the women find everything. Another bit of verbal irony is actually a line. I think Mrs. Hale says it earlier in the play, really in the first third of the play. She says something along the lines of, men's hands are not as clean as you would think. Or something like that. I would consider this actually an example of foreshadowing, but it would count as verbal irony right here. She's kind of hinting at the fact that, you know what, maybe John Wright actually is not as good a man as anyone would think. It's a little hint early in the play that maybe some of this is John Wright's fault. The last clever piece of verbal irony is the last line of the play, where Mrs. Hale says, "We call it, not it, Mr. Henderson." And the thing to note in this line right here is the similarity between knotting it, which is tying up the quilt itself, and not it. So notice how that sounds the same right there. This is highlighting the fact that at the very end of the play, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are covering for Mrs. Wright. They know, for all intents and purposes, that Minnie Wright killed her husband, but at the end they basically say, not it, she didn't do it, even though it's clear to them that she did. Notice also the similarity between tying a knot in the quilt itself and tying a knot in the rope used to hang Mr. Wright. That too is a little bit of verbal irony there too. Again, this is harder to see, but just notice how it highlights themes. First of all, that the women are being mistreated in this play. That it is those small details. They are the intelligent ones in this play. That men themselves are not as clean, are not as high and mighty as one would think. And then at the end, that the women take that measure to cover for Mrs. Wright, even though she is most likely guilty of murder. How does all this irony build up to a theme? In class, this is something that we'll be brainstorming together, but I'll kind of give it to you right here. As we start thinking through paragraph writing for this play, we have to identify the central theme of this play too, and it has to do with how women are treated. The theme of Trifles, at least this is the theme that I get out of this play, the central theme of this play, is that mistreatment or abuse or oppression, whatever word you want to use right there, I'll even use some slashes. Abuse, oppression, forces women to take drastic actions. Now, this play is an example of early feminist literature, so it definitely has some hard things to say about men and some controversial things to say about women. But one thing to note right here is that we see this in two different ways in this play. For one, Minnie Wright was mistreated by her husband. Emotionally abused, he strangled her canary. He's kept her in isolation, away from other people. She's not happy in their marriage. You could even frame it as being oppression. And it forced her to do a drastic action. Now, we can argue whether she had to murder her husband or not, or whether it was right for her to murder her husband or not. But that is a drastic action that she felt she needed to take. She was under such emotional pressure that she felt she had to kill her husband. It's a drastic measure. The other way that we see this in this play, though, is in Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. Now, are they abused by their husbands? Maybe, maybe not. But they are mistreated throughout the play, aren't they? The men look down on the women throughout this play. They kind of make fun of them for only caring about the things in the kitchen. They kind of scoff at women as being less than men throughout this play. And as they kind of face these comments and these remarks and this mistreatment throughout the play, it makes them want more and more to cover for Mrs. Wright. And at the end of the play, that's what they do. They make a pretty drastic decision right there to cover up the fact that Mrs. Wright is a murderer. Consider especially that Mrs. Hale is married to a witness in this case. Mr. Hale is the one who found the dead body. And Mrs. Peters is married to the sheriff. She is hiding a crime from her husband, who's the sheriff of this town. Now, what I'm asking you to write for me here is a paragraph explaining how one of the play's symbols relates to this theme. And I'm giving you three options right here. There are it's actually all the major pieces of evidence in this play are also symbolic for Mrs. Wright. While I can't give you all of the answers as to what these symbols mean as they pertain to Mrs. Wright, I will give you some hints. First of all, the first piece of evidence that anyone finds in this play is the broken jar of preserves. What I want you to consider with the broken jar of preserves and how that might connect to Mrs. Wright is that jar of preserves exploded, it blew up, after being under a lot of pressure. So you can choose that as a symbol. Focus especially on the pressure that Mrs. Wright was under in her marriage. Another symbol, though the first one that the women actually find, is Mrs. Wright's quilt. As a reminder, what the women notice about the quilt is that the stitching gets worse and worse over time. You can probably draw a connection between Mrs. Wright's quilt and her mental or emotional state in her marriage. Consider especially how the stitching gets worse and worse over time. The third symbol, and the biggest piece of evidence that the women find in the play, is the dead canary. What you might want to trace is the big similarity between the canary and Mrs. Wright's past. Remember that the women said that Mrs. Wright was pretty and lively and could sing when she was younger. Consider the fact that canaries do the same thing, and that canary is dead. You can probably draw a connection between that canary and Mrs. Wright's past. First of all, in your topic sentence, you want to choose the symbol that you want to reflect on. What you can do is highlight it or underline it. Control-U is underline. Control-Alt-H is highlight, or you can use the highlight function on Word Online right there. I don't know why it highlighted mine in blue. I like yellow. There we go. You can choose whichever symbol you like, and your topic sentence is written. In your evidence, you'll want to explain what that symbol means. So if I'm choosing the broken jar of preserves, I'll say, so the broken jar of preserves is a symbol that relates to this theme. This item represents the pressure, the emotional faced in her marriage. Blah, blah, blah. I'll explain what that means even further in my evidence. In my commentary, I'm then going to explain further how that connects to the themes, how mistreatment forces women to take drastic actions. I'm going to draw that connection in a couple of sentences in my commentary. Then in my summary sentence, I will tie it all up. For the sake of this paragraph, your summary sentence might look similar to your topic sentence, and that's totally fine. I mostly just want to use this assignment to check in that you remember how to structure a well-written paragraph. Best of luck to you as you write. Once again, please reach out to me in Teams if you're struggling with this assignment. I'm here to help you understand and write.